Hello friends! Today I have another Zoom Circus show that goes wrong related making of video. I'm going to be talking about making my costume. So join me for thoughts on pattern drafting, on spandex, and on way too many sequins. So for a while, I've been inspired by these beautiful pleated dresses that go from a striped skirt to a solid color bodice, all because you hide one of the colors of the stripes inside the pleats. And they're great. They add a lot of fullness to the skirt, they add a lot of shaping in the bodice, they add this remarkable color contrast, and it's all done in the pleating and folding, and it's super clever, and I love it. So I've wanted to do something at least inspired by that. And my castmates with the Zoom Circus show that goes wrong probably enabled my absolute worst characteristics when they were excited about doing a vaguely steampunk turn of the last century vibe to go with what at that point we thought was largely going to be a soundtrack of accordion music. And I honestly don't think that any of that actually made it into the final show, other than a bunch of us were wearing stripes. But it definitely provided an excuse to make this costume with this vibe that I already knew I wanted to make. I'm also currently in stash busting mode, which means I am prohibiting myself from getting any additional fabric or yarn or sundries until I work down the rather excessive amount that I currently have filling up my closet. And good news, I had about 10 yards of this incredibly dramatic black and white striped spandex, which 10 yards is a lot of spandex. Like that's a lot of leotards. And it was just sitting on my shelf for years. So great reason to make this costume using this material. And I definitely have enough to make up a mock-up, which is a thing that I never actually do because I'm the least careful seamstress ever. I do, however, usually at least try to make a pattern, and that is what I did first. And I pretty rapidly determined that my complete and utter lack of any straight edges in the house was going to be a big problem. I usually use store-bought patterns, and so it doesn't really matter if you have a yardstick. But for this, since I wanted something that was very geometric, very straight lines along those vertical stripes, I needed an actual straight edge. And what I got when I was using a very bendy piece of boning instead was a lot of curves. So I got around it using a HEPA filter, since it was the largest and most rectangular thing that I had on hand at that moment. Relatedly, I have since then purchased for myself a large clear ruler and a set of tailor's curves, and they are absolutely glorious, and I love them. I ended up with these very boxy looking leg pieces. The dresses that I was inspired by are mostly achieved with pleats, with the sort of white stripes folded under and then pressed flat to achieve something very uniform and black. And spandex is exactly the wrong fabric to try to do this in because it doesn't crease and it certainly doesn't lie flat. It stretches and it moves. Pleating spandex, making any kind of really structured garment that will hold its shape if you aren't in it out of spandex, makes about as much sense as like building a gingerbread house out of pudding. It doesn't have the integrity to really stand up to it. But I could fold under the white stripes into darts, which would make the top part skinnier than the bottom part, so I would get a sort of shaping effect with a sort of trompe-l'oeil stripe, in theory. Again, because spandex stretches and slides, doing detailed work like sewing right at the edge of a stripe is very difficult. The edge of the stripe keeps moving around. So I knew I would have to tack it down really well if I was going to be able to use my machine to sew these darts. This was probably the second most time-intensive step because I'm very slow at hand stitching and there were a lot of white stripes to tack down. I was surprised I shouldn't have been, but I was, with just how much width I was losing to these darts. So by the time I had basted all the darts and sewed the two legs together, I expected it to not go around my belly even a little. But I was pleasantly surprised. It definitely held together nicely. And sewing down the darts was relatively straightforward. So at the end of it, I had a pair of pants that I rather liked, and that stood up to the whole routine I had planned out as well. I paired them with this discount dance supply crop top for rehearsal, and I actually really liked the look, and still like the look, of this high collar crisscrossed back with the striped bottom half, especially since it felt probably the most steampunk of my options. I seriously considered just tacking the bottom half onto the crop top and calling it a day, and I was super excited about the idea of just being done and having something good. Until I realized that, one, it would need to be tacked down because the belly of the pants and the bottom of the crop top both move around. And two, the pants need to be stepped into, and the crop top needs to be pulled on from above, so if I actually did stitch them together, there would be no way for me to actually put the outfit on. I still want to come back to that idea and make something that actually is high-collared and has some kind of crisscrossy back, but works as a unitard, so, that's on my project goals for eventually, but for this one, I didn't know how that was going to work, so I decided to make myself a much more basic top half out of this dove gray spandex that I also had lying around. It is a circus costume, though, so I wanted to add a little bit more visual interest, which is to say sparkle, which is to say sequins. And I was hoping to use these sequins to accomplish two additional things. The first was to visually obscure the waistline. I had two things that I wanted to sort of hide. There were a couple places where the darts at the very, very top were not actually perfect, and you could see some of the white stripe coming through. And secondly, because the pants were so much darker than the top half, sometimes you could see the dark material of the pants, that seam on the inside, ghosting through the lighter material of the top half. So I wanted to obscure the waistline. The second thing that I wanted to do was, add a little bit more of an optical illusion of an hourglass figure, because one, I am vain, and two, the shelf bra had really flattened me out. I had all of these absolutely delightful peacock-colored mermaid sequins left over from making a couple costumes for Smoky Mirrors. I got them in fabric, and in order to sew with that fabric, I had to remove all of the sequins from all of the seam allowances, which was a lot of sequins. And I'm a pack rat, so I saved all of them, in theory, to attach to more costumes later, which has now actually happened. Point being, I had tons of them. I attached them in a totally organic way, which is to say, I knew roughly that I wanted to make a kind of sequin belt, but with a bit more going on than just that. So I'd stretch a piece of spandex over the hoop and turn on a TV show and embroider on the sequins however I thought looked good on that day. Now, I would not do it this way in the future. I would absolutely carefully plan out what I was doing, up to and including drawing it on the spandex while wearing the costume, before I started embroidering on my very first sequin. I would also strongly encourage future Elizabeth to use some appliques instead of embroidering sequins on one by one, because it is so very much less work and so much more visually striking. Next time! I was also a little bit worried since I was hand stitching the sequins on with basically a running stitch between multiple sequins that it would make the fabric less stretchy overall and I would end up not being able to fit into the costume. I tried to prevent this in two ways. First, by stretching the spandex out ahead of time to make sure that I wasn't completely ruining the stretch of the costume, and also by zigzagging my way up and down, doing 2 rows of sequins at a time so that the thread wasn't going in one direction for too long and didn't get too tight. But also, I am paranoid as heck, and I needed to rehearse my act, so I also tested it at multiple stages during the embellishment process, which lasted pretty much until the moment that we started filming. And I was generally relieved each time when I hadn't made it completely unwearable. I think I achieved 2 of my 3 sequin-related goals. I definitely made it more visually interesting of a costume, and I was able to successfully obscure any sort of problems I might have had on that waistline. However, I pretty quickly realized that creating a fake hourglass figure and embellishing the entire waistline are 2 goals that are absolutely 100% at odds with each other. And this is another reason that if I do it again, I will carefully plan out exactly where I want to put the sequins ahead of time, because in retrospect, I needed to decide between those 2 things instead of blithely trying to do both when I started and then realizing that, yeah, that wasn't going to work. Overall, I am really happy with how this turned out, especially given just how experimental it was. We can say experimental, right? Because I had no idea what I was doing. But were I to do it again, and I suspect I will because I still like this idea for a costume, and this one is not a perfect iteration of it, there are a few things that I would do differently. First, like I mentioned, I really loved the look of the high-necked, crisscrossy back top half that goes with this flared-out, striped bottom half. And I would want to play with that a lot more. I think that if I make the fake turtleneck close in the back and I lower down the start of the crisscrosses in the back, I can make an opening big enough for me to fit myself through, and that then this entire thing will work. So that's going to be the design of the next one that I make. Second, I would widen the pants even further. The darts take it in by a substantial amount, and taking it in farther would actually give me more flexibility because I could, you can always take in more and it'll still include the entire white stripe, but you're sort of limited to a minimum. And it would also make it flare out more dramatically into the striped bit, which would be really, really full pants, which I think would look incredibly dramatic and super, super fun. I would also make it a little bit higher waisted at the top. Once I accounted for like seam allowances and stuff, it was somewhat higher waisted, but with another couple inches, I could make that waistline this really interesting sort of upward spike corselet shape, and that would mean that the waistline itself would already be obscured, and I could put the sequins specifically where I wanted to create more of a sort of illusion of a sharp hourglass, which I think would improve the entire thing substantially. Third, I'm hopeful to find a pattern for a built-in bra that allows for a little bit more curve than the shelf bra, because that really flattened me out. I'm also hopeful that this won't involve going into foam insert land, because I have seen those and they give you cone boobs. So I'm looking for something where fabrics of different stiffnesses and different stretchinesses will create some shape without, going too far in the other direction. Lastly, like I said, plan out sequin placement so that there's at least some intentionality. And use appliques where I don't need as much stretch in the overall shape of the garment, because it's just so much more bang for my buck. So I hope you enjoyed this look into my completely Wild West, not a tutorial, messing around version of making a circus costume. I had a shocking amount of fun actually making it, and I will definitely be doing more of this in the future and sharing it with you as well. And until then, bye-bye.